Let me be direct with you from the outset, because the situation unfolding in the Persian Gulf demands directness. What we are witnessing is not a temporary standoff. It is not a diplomatic chess match that will resolve itself through negotiations in Geneva or Vienna. What we are witnessing is the complete recalibration of power dynamics in the Middle East, happening in real time, and most people do not even realize the magnitude of what is taking place right now. I am sitting here looking at intelligence assessments that have been circulating among European military analysts for the past 48 hours, and I need you to understand what they contain. These are not assessments about missile ranges. They are not about nuclear enrichment capacity. They are not about hypersonic weapons or drone capabilities. What these assessments detail is Iran's asymmetric naval strategy in the Strait of Hormuz, and the conclusions are stark. According to multiple defense analysts cited by Defense Security Asia and corroborated by reporting from The Telegraph, Iran has positioned itself to impose costs on American naval operations that the Pentagon cannot sustain indefinitely. In the next 20 minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly why Iran's response to Trump's blockade represents a strategic inflection point, why the economic consequences are already cascading through global markets, and why this crisis reveals something fundamental about the limits of American military power in 2026. This is a detailed analysis you will not find condensed into 3-minute segments on cable news. Subscribe now if you have not already, because what we are about to cover is being actively discussed in defense ministries across Europe and Asia, and the implications extend far beyond the Middle East. Let's start with geography, because geography is destiny in this conflict. The Strait of Hormuz is approximately 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. That is roughly 20 miles. To put that in perspective, that is narrower than the English Channel at Dover, narrower than the Bosporus approach to Istanbul, and far narrower than any choke point the United States Navy has had to seriously contest since the Second World War. The average depth is between 40 and 90 meters, shallow enough that conventional submarine warfare becomes exceptionally difficult, but deep enough that small, quiet submarines can operate effectively if designed correctly. This matters because approximately 21 million barrels of oil pass through the Strait of Hormuz every single day. That represents roughly 21% of global petroleum consumption. When you add liquefied natural gas shipments, the total energy flow represents nearly 30% of all seaborne traded oil and gas. The International Energy Agency has described the strait as the world's most important oil transit choke point. That is not hyperbole. That is a technical assessment of global energy infrastructure vulnerability. According to Lloyd's List Intelligence and multiple shipping insurers, the insurance premiums for tankers transiting the strait have increased by 300 to 500% since Trump announced the blockade enforcement on April 7th. 300 to 500%. That is not a marginal adjustment. That is a fundamental repricing of risk that makes many shipments economically non-viable even before a single shot is fired. If you operate a business with any logistics component whatsoever, if you drive a vehicle, if you heat your home with oil or natural gas, what is happening in the Strait of Hormuz is not a foreign policy story. It is a cost of living story, and you are feeling it already. Subscribe if you are watching this and realizing you are not getting this level of analysis anywhere else. The mainstream media coverage focuses on missile strikes and carrier group movements, but they are missing the strategic architecture underneath. Now let's talk about what Iran actually built. Announcement number 1, the Ghadir-class submarines. And this one matters more than anything else happening in the Persian Gulf theater right now. Iran operates between 17 and 23 Ghadir-class midget submarines, depending on which intelligence estimate you credit. These vessels are 29 meters long, displace approximately 120 tons, and are purpose-built for one operational environment, shallow, congested littoral waters exactly like the Strait of Hormuz. They are diesel-electric propulsion, which means when running on battery power, they are virtually silent. American nuclear submarines, for all their technological superiority, generate constant low-frequency noise from their reactor cooling systems. The Ghadirs do not. Commander Daniel Dolan, a U.S. Navy submarine warfare officer, described these vessels in a 2024 assessment as, and I am quoting him directly here, well designed for guerrilla warfare, ambushes, and anti-access area denial operations. That phrase, anti-access area denial, is Pentagon terminology for making it prohibitively costly for an adversary to operate in a given space. That is exactly what these submarines were designed to do. According to Jane's Defense Weekly, and confirmed by multiple Western naval analysts, each Ghadir can carry 2 heavyweight torpedoes, or 8 mines. They can sit silently on the seafloor for extended periods, their small size and non-metallic hull components making them exceptionally difficult to detect with conventional sonar. When U.S. naval officials publicly state they have full visibility on Iranian naval assets, they are referring to surface vessels and larger submarines. The Ghadirs are a different problem entirely. The Iranian Navy currently operates these submarines in rotating patrols. At any given time, according to open source intelligence assessments, between 4 and 8 Gadirs are deployed in the strait and the approaches to it. That number matters because it means American carrier strike groups and supply vessels must assume hostile submarines are present in any transit operation. The operational stress of maintaining anti-submarine warfare vigilance continuously in shallow water against small quiet targets is immense. It is exhausting, expensive, and it degrades readiness over time. Received. That is announcement number 1. Announcement number 2, the mine warfare capability. And this is the part that keeps U.S. naval planners awake at night. Iran possesses one of the largest inventories of naval mines in the world. Estimates range from 3,000 to 5,000 mines of various types, including bottom mines, moored mines, and what are classified as intelligent mines. Intelligent mines can distinguish between different types of vessels based on acoustic signature and magnetic profile. They can lie dormant while small craft pass overhead, then activate when a large commercial tanker or warship approaches. The International Maritime Organization has documented that modern intelligent mines are nearly impossible to sweep using conventional methods without knowing their exact locations and technical specifications. Stay with me because this is where the narrative completely changes and where the economic implications become impossible to ignore. Iran does not need to actually deploy thousands of mines to achieve strategic effect. The mere credible threat of mining operations is sufficient to alter the entire risk calculus for commercial shipping. This is not speculation. This is exactly what happened during the tanker war in the 1980s. Between 1984 and 1988, Iran laid approximately 300 mines in the Persian Gulf. Those 300 mines, combined with the threat of additional mining, required a massive international minesweeping operation involving dozens of vessels from multiple navies. Commercial traffic slowed dramatically, insurance costs skyrocketed, and this was with 1980s mine technology. According to reporting by Reuters and statements from multiple maritime security firms, several shipping companies have already suspended transit operations through the strait pending resolution of the current crisis. Not because mines have been confirmed in the water, because the risk assessment no longer justifies the transit fees, even at premium rates. Think carefully about what this represents. Iran has achieved a degree of maritime denial without firing a shot, simply by possessing credible capability and demonstrating willingness to use it. U.S. Navy Captain Tracy A. Vincent acknowledged publicly in a March 2026 briefing that mine countermeasures operations in the Strait would require weeks of intensive work by specialized vessels that are in short supply. Weeks, during which commercial traffic would be halted completely. The economic cost of a 2-week closure of the Strait of Hormuz has been estimated by energy economists at between $300 billion and $600 billion in lost economic output globally, and that assumes the closure is temporary and orderly. A closure under combat conditions, with uncertainty about when transit could safely resume, would trigger significantly larger economic disruptions. Announcement number 3, and this one almost nobody in the mainstream media is connecting correctly: the European response. On April 9th, just 2 days after Trump announced the blockade, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom issued a joint statement expressing grave concern about escalation in the Persian Gulf and calling for immediate de-escalation and diplomatic engagement. That phrasing might sound like standard diplomatic boilerplate, but read between the lines. These are America's closest European allies, and they publicly broke with U.S. policy within 48 hours. On April 10th, French President Emmanuel Macron spoke directly with Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian. On April 11th, Germany's foreign minister flew to Tehran. These were not courtesy calls. These were crisis intervention missions undertaken by European powers trying to prevent an economic catastrophe that would devastate their economies more severely than America's. Here is what you need to understand. Europe imports approximately 27% of its oil from the Middle East. Much of that oil transits the Strait of Hormuz. A sustained closure or even significant disruption would trigger an energy crisis in Europe more severe than the disruptions caused by the Ukraine war. Germany's industrial sector, which still relies heavily on petrochemical feedstocks and petroleum-based manufacturing inputs, would face production shutdowns within weeks. This is existential for European economic stability. Trump responded to European diplomatic outreach by calling European leaders weak and suggesting they were betraying American interests. This has not notably changed European behavior. Think carefully about what this represents. When the United States conducts a major military operation, and its oldest and most important allies not only refuse to participate, but actively work to undermine American strategy through separate diplomatic channels, that is not a minor policy disagreement. That is a verdict on American judgment. Received. That is announcement number 3. Now, let's talk about what is really happening behind the headlines, because there are 2 stories playing out simultaneously, and the mainstream media is only covering one of them. The first story, the one you see on CNN and Fox News, is about military posturing, carrier movements. Missile strikes. Tough rhetoric from Washington and Tehran. That story is real, but it is incomplete. The second story, the one that matters more in the long run, is about economic architecture and alliance structures. China has been conspicuously quiet throughout this crisis. Official statements from Beijing have called for restraint and dialogue, standard diplomatic language. But behind the scenes, according to multiple reports from Bloomberg and the Financial Times, Chinese state-owned enterprises have been signing long-term oil supply contracts with Iran at discounted rates, taking advantage of Iran's need to maintain export revenue while Western buyers pull back. China is not intervening to stop this crisis. China is positioning itself to benefit from it. Approximately 90% of Iranian oil exports currently go to China. That percentage has actually increased over the past 3 years, as Western sanctions tightened and other buyers withdrew from the market. What this means in practice is that any American strategy that relies on economically isolating Iran is fundamentally incomplete if it does not account for Chinese willingness to absorb Iranian exports. And China has demonstrated repeatedly that it will not subordinate its energy security interests to American foreign policy preferences. This creates a paradox at the heart of American strategy. The blockade is meant to pressure Iran by threatening its oil exports, but the primary customer for those exports is China, which is not participating in the blockade. So the actual economic pressure on Iran is limited, while the economic pressure on Europe and other American allies is severe. The costs of the blockade are being borne primarily by America's friends, not its adversaries. If you own a vehicle or operate a business dependent on logistics, the freight costs embedded in everything you purchase have increased between 8 and 15% since early April. Not because supply chains are actually disrupted yet, because the risk premium for that potential disruption is being priced into every transaction. You are paying for this blockade every time you fill your tank or receive a shipment. That is the second story, and it is the one that will determine how long this crisis can be sustained politically. Meanwhile, the American military position in the Gulf is more complex than official statements suggest. The United States currently has two carrier strike groups in the region, USS Theodore Roosevelt and USS Gerald R. Ford. That represents enormous firepower, but it also represents an enormous logistical tail. Those carriers and their escorts require continuous resupply of fuel, munitions, food, spare parts. Every supply vessel transiting the strait to reach those carriers is vulnerable to exactly the threats we discussed earlier: submarines, mines, missile attacks. The U.S. Navy is extremely capable at power projection. What it is less optimized for, and what very few navies are optimized for, is sustained defensive operations in confined hostile waters against asymmetric threats. The operational tempo required to maintain anti-submarine warfare vigilance, mine countermeasures readiness, and air defense posture simultaneously 24 hours per day for weeks or months is grinding. It degrades readiness. It creates maintenance backlogs. It exhausts crews. There is a reason the U.S. Navy prefers to operate in blue water, open ocean environments where its technological advantages are maximized. The Strait of Hormuz is the opposite environment. It is confined, shallow, close to hostile shore-based missile batteries, and subject to asymmetric threats that minimize American advantages. This is by design. Iran spent 40 years preparing for exactly this scenario. Now, this pattern has repeated throughout history, and every time it repeats, the outcome is the same. Let me take you back to the Peloponnesian War, the devastating conflict between Athens and Sparta that lasted 27 years and destroyed both powers. Athens was a naval empire, wealthy, technologically advanced, with the most powerful fleet in the Mediterranean. Sparta was a land power, militarily formidable, but economically limited. They went to war, and both sides assumed their advantages would lead to victory. Athens thought its navy and wealth would outlast Sparta. Sparta thought its army would crush Athens. For 27 years they fought, draining each other's treasuries, killing each other's soldiers, devastating the Greek world. And who won? Neither of them. Both Athens and Sparta were exhausted, bankrupt, and broken by the end of the war. And who actually benefited? Persia. The Persian Empire, which had been defeated by the Greeks decades earlier, watched the Greeks destroy each other, then reasserted influence over the region when both Athens and Sparta were too weak to resist. Persia did not win through military conquest. Persia won through patience and strategic positioning, while its adversaries exhausted themselves. The parallel to today is exact. The United States is locked in an escalating confrontation with Iran. Both sides believe their strategic advantages will prevail. America has technological superiority and economic power. Iran has geographic advantage and asymmetric capabilities. They could fight for months or years, imposing severe costs on each other and devastating the region. And who benefits? China. China does not need to fight a war in the Persian Gulf. China needs the United States and Iran to exhaust themselves, while Chinese economic influence expands into the vacuum created by the conflict. Beijing is already offering financing for reconstruction projects in war-torn areas of the Middle East. Chinese state-owned enterprises are signing long-term contracts for mineral rights, port facilities, and infrastructure development. The Belt and Road Initiative is positioning Chinese companies to dominate the economic landscape of the region for decades. America and Iran are fighting over security architecture. China is building economic architecture. And in the 21st century, economic architecture ultimately determines geopolitical outcomes more than military positioning. This is not speculation. This is the lesson of every major power conflict in modern history. The powers that fight exhaust themselves. The powers that position strategically emerge stronger. Unless this conflict de-escalates rapidly, we are watching a repeat of the Peloponnesian War play out in slow motion in the Persian Gulf, with China in the role of Persia. So, where does this leave us? Let me give you three clear paths, because there is no honest middle ground here. Path 1. De-escalation through European mediation. France, Germany, and other European powers succeed in brokering a temporary arrangement where Iran commits to keeping the strait open, the United States lifts the blockade, and both sides step back from immediate confrontation. This requires Trump to accept a face-saving compromise, which is uncertain given his historical negotiating style. It requires Iran to trust that any agreement will be honored, which is difficult given the U.S. withdrawal from the nuclear deal in 2018. Probability, maybe 30%. This is the optimistic scenario. Path 2. Sustained low-intensity conflict. The blockade continues. Iran conducts limited attacks on commercial shipping or U.S. assets. America responds with airstrikes on Iranian facilities, but both sides avoid full-scale war. This becomes a grinding stalemate that lasts months, during which oil prices remain elevated, global economic growth slows, European economies suffer recession, and China continues expanding influence. Neither side wins militarily, both sides pay enormous costs, and the global economic damage is severe. Probability, approximately 50%. This is the muddling through scenario, and it is worse than it sounds. Path 3. Major escalation. An Iranian mine sinks a U.S. warship or a commercial tanker with significant casualties, or an American airstrike kills senior Iranian leadership. The conflict spirals into sustained military operations. Iran closes the strait completely, potentially for weeks. Oil prices spike above $150 per barrel. Global recession follows. The political consequences cascade through both countries and across the region. This is the nightmare scenario, and while less likely than Path 2, it is not improbable. Maybe 20% probability, which is far too high for a scenario this catastrophic. I think we are closer to Path 2 than the headlines suggest. Both sides have invested too much politically to back down easily, but both sides also understand the costs of full escalation. What that means in practice is a slow-burning crisis that degrades into the background of global affairs while imposing steady economic costs on everyone except China. The strait remains technically open, but effectively constrained. Insurance costs stay elevated, oil prices remain volatile, European economies stagnate, and 6 months from now, we are still having versions of this same conversation. Here are the questions I want you to take away. First, how long can European economies sustain elevated energy costs before political pressure forces a break with U.S. policy? Second, at what point does China's strategic positioning in the region become irreversible, regardless of how the Iran confrontation resolves? And third, what does it mean for American credibility when its closest allies publicly work against its stated strategic objectives? Tell me in the comments what you think the probability is for each of these three paths. Tell me if you think there is a fourth scenario I have not considered. Tell me whether you believe Trump can accept a negotiated compromise or whether his political base requires continued confrontation. These are the variables that will determine whether this crisis burns out or explodes. We will keep tracking every development in the Strait of Hormuz, every diplomatic initiative, every economic indicator, and every shift in the military balance. That is what this channel does every single day. We provide the analysis that cuts through the noise and shows you what is actually happening behind the headlines. Subscribe now. Share this analysis with everyone in your network who is trying to understand what is really unfolding in the Persian Gulf. Turn on notifications so you do not miss the next update. The situation is fluid, the stakes are enormous, and the mainstream media is not giving you the full picture. We will see you in the next analysis.